No one remembers what the keynote was about that night. They only remember the woman in the black dress standing under the cold white stage lights. A stage meant for growth charts, future roadmaps, and the familiar praise of technology saving humanity. San Francisco, an autumn night. The wind from the bay moved against the glass walls of the convention center like a long exhale. Inside, the elite of Silicon Valley sat in glowing circles. Venture funds, founders, tech media, people accustomed to watching history get written through handshakes. And then they saw her, Dr. Zora Bennett, the woman the press called the mind that taught machines to see patients as human. The woman who received weekly letters from students of color that all said the same thing. You make it possible for us to exist in rooms like this. She arrived alone. No husband beside her, no communications team, no signature smile. The black dress she wore had nothing extra. Clean lines, a high neckline, long sleeves. An elegance so severe it felt intentional, as if she hadn't come to be seen, but to end something. The cameras turned toward her on instinct, not because anything was wrong, but because whenever Zora Bennett entered a room, the room understood that something important was happening. Her name appeared on the massive screen behind the stage. Keynote, Ethics in the Age of Intelligent Systems. Applause rose, polite, steady, reverent. She stepped to the podium, stopped, didn't open her tablet, didn't look at the speech. She simply stood there, long enough for the atmosphere to tilt off its familiar axis. In the third row, a tech journalist lowered his pen. At the back of the room, a venture partner leaned forward. Someone whispered, "Where's Ethan?" Zora answered none of those questions. Instead, she turned slightly to her left. A man in a gray suit stood near the side stairs. Not a guest, not staff. He held a slim leather folder, his expression professionally blank. A process server. At a tech summit, the combination silenced the entire room before anyone understood why. Zora walked toward him, every step calm, almost gentle, as if she were crossing a familiar room in her own home, not moving through hundreds of eyes, just beginning to realize they were witnessing something irreversible. She opened her clutch, took out an envelope, thin, white, no name. Her voice wasn't loud, but the microphone carried every syllable. Please confirm receipt. That was all. No explanation, no accusation. The man nodded, accepted the envelope, signed a confirmation sheet, a simple legal ritual that belonged in courthouse hallways, not under the lights of a global conference. The sound of the pen on paper echoed with strange clarity in the silence. Then Zora did the thing that made the entire room stop breathing. She raised her hand, her fingers, long, steady. The wedding ring, the emerald-cut diamond Ethan once said was strong, clean, impossible to ignore, like you, slid slowly from her finger. She didn't look at it, didn't kiss it, didn't hesitate. She placed it on top of the envelope, a soft click. But in that moment, it sounded like a door closing forever. The cameras exploded, flash after flash. Someone stood up. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Zora turned away, didn't answer questions, didn't look at the audience, didn't rush. She walked off the stage as if she had just finished delivering a long speech, a speech that had never needed words. Outside, the glass doors opened, and the bay wind rushed in, lifting the edge of her dress. And if you look closely in that moment, there was no triumph on her face, only stillness. The stillness of a person who had finally set down something too heavy to keep carrying. The video of that moment spread in under 15 minutes. No one knew what was inside the envelope. No one knew what had happened to the marriage once called the most stable partnership in ethical tech. But everyone knew this. A black woman had stood at the center of Silicon Valley's power and ended her marriage without raising her voice. Under the first viral post, the comments stacked endlessly. That's not revenge. That's control. She didn't break. She concluded. What did he do? And the most liked comment, "Tell us the story." If you're still watching, you're probably asking the same question. Maybe you've seen a relationship that looked perfect from the outside and wondered what held it together on the inside. Love or silence? Stay with this story. Hit like if that moment moves something in your chest. Leave a comment, not about the scandal, but about the power of choosing the moment truth is spoken. And follow the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because every image has a past, and the past of this marriage began with a vow given to the wrong person. 6 months before that night, Zora Bennett still believed the woman standing beside her at her wedding was the one who would protect her love, even when she didn't see it breaking. Her name was Lila Hart, and this story didn't begin with betrayal. It began with trust. Before the images spread like a storm, before the wedding ring rested on the white envelope like an irreversible period, there had been a story Silicon Valley believed in. They believed in Zora Bennett and Ethan Cole the way people believe in a perfect formula: precise, balanced, and incapable of failure. Mornings in Palo Alto began with sunlight sliding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse. It always reached Zora first, along her cheekbones, down the straight bridge of her nose, into those deep amber eyes that always seemed to be reading an invisible stream of data. She would stand on the balcony with a cup of hot tea, reviewing clinical reports from hospitals running her company's AI. To others, the numbers were dry. To Zora, they were heartbeats. Proof that an algorithm she had written was helping a doctor in Detroit detect a tumor earlier. Proof that a patient in Oakland was receiving the right treatment in time. Ethan appeared behind her like a habit that had been perfectly coded. "You're working before the sun is even up," he would say, his voice still rough with sleep. He always wore pressed white shirts, even on weekends. A kind of precision that made people believe he controlled everything: schedules, capital, outcomes. Ethan Cole was the man boardrooms relaxed for. A partner at one of the most powerful venture funds. The kind of man who could turn an unknown startup into a TechCrunch headline with a single nod. If Zora was vision, Ethan was access. If Zora was the future, Ethan was the one who made that future fundable. They didn't need many words to understand each other. At fundraising galas in Menlo Park, when Zora was surrounded by scientists and journalists, Ethan would rest his hand lightly at the small of her back. Not possessive, not performative, just a perfect period at the end of every conversation. "Dr. Bennett is changing the way medicine thinks," he would say, his pride never concealed. "And I'm just lucky enough to witness it up close." People smiled. Not the polite smile of networking, but the smile reserved for something they believed was real. A mature kind of love. Quiet, undramatic, steady. The media gave them a name: the ethical empire. A black woman building life-saving technology. A white man navigating the architecture of capital. Two different orbits meeting at the point where ambition became legacy. And Lila was always there, never in the middle, never too far away. She appeared in every important photograph, rarely the center. The woman with dark brown hair and sharp eyes that seemed to read stories before they were told. Zora's chief brand strategist, the one journalists called the architect behind the narrative. Lila chose the color language for the campaign when Zora prepared to announce Phase 3 trials. Lila sat beside Ethan at strategic breakfasts, shaping how deals were positioned so they would never dilute the ethical image Zora had built. "Reputation is not what people think about you," she once said on a panel, her voice low and steady. "It's what they repeat when you're not in the room." Zora trusted her, not just because Lila was brilliant, but because Lila had been there before everything. Before the glass office on Sand Hill Road. Before the headlines calling Zora the future of healthcare AI. Before Ethan appeared with a ring in his hand and a question that silenced an entire room. They had met at a conference for women of color in STEM, when both of them were still fighting to be heard in rooms full of men. Lila had helped Zora craft the first presentation that made an investor lean forward and say, "Tell us more." And on Zora's wedding day, it was Lila who stood behind her as she walked down the aisle. Not as a bridesmaid, but in the role Zora's family called the vow keeper, the one who would protect the marriage if either of them ever lost their way. When Lila placed her hand on the Bible and said, "I will guard what you build together, even when you cannot see the cracks," her voice did not tremble. Zora had cried. Not from emotion, from safety. In a world where everything could be acquired, broken, replaced, she believed she had found two people who would never leave. Evenings at home were quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. Not the cold silence of distance, but the stillness of two people who understood the value of not needing to speak. Ethan read financial reports in the leather chair by the window. Zora lay across the sofa with her laptop, blue light reflecting across her skin. Sometimes he would look up at her as if he were still surprised she existed. "Do you ever stop thinking?" he asked once. Zora smiled without looking away from the screen. "Only when you're looking at me like that." Moments like that, never filmed, never posted, were what made people believe they were real. At private dinners, when it was just the three of them, Lila usually sat across from them, listening more than she spoke. She knew which wine Ethan preferred. She knew what Zora would order without opening the menu. There were nights when Ethan and Lila debated a deal, their words fast and sharp like attorneys in a courtroom, and Zora watched them with pride. "My two favorite strategists," she would say. No one noticed Lila's gaze linger half a second too long on Ethan. No one noticed the quiet exhale Ethan gave when Lila agreed with him. No one noticed, because no one looks for cracks in a perfect wall. Silicon Valley loved them because they represented a story the Valley desperately needed. That power could coexist with ethics. That ambition could coexist with love. That a Black woman did not have to choose between success and respect. In interviews, when asked how she maintained balance, Zora always said, "I built a life where I don't have to shrink to be loved." Ethan sat beside her and nodded. Lila stood behind the camera and smiled. That was the picture the world saw. A picture with no shadows. A picture hung too high for anyone to think to check the fractures behind it. And while the city praised them as the symbol of the future, while articles called them untouchable, something was shifting. So quietly that even Zora, who could detect the smallest anomaly in a data model, didn't see it. It wasn't betrayal. Not yet. It was a realignment. A glance held a second longer than necessary. A conversation ending with a smile a third person couldn't read. A familiarity turning into something private. Changes so small that if you didn't believe in your love completely, you would have seen them immediately. But Zora believed, and that belief turned her marriage into the safest place she knew, and the only place she never thought to defend. Perfection never shatters with a loud sound. It changes temperature first. One morning, Zora noticed her tea cooled faster than usual as she stood on the balcony. The wind from the bay moved the same way it always had, the sunlight still sliding across the glass towers across from them. But behind her, there were no familiar footsteps. Ethan had left earlier, not for the first time. Just for the first time, she registered it. His coffee cup was still on the kitchen counter, the warmth gone, leaving a pale brown ring, the trace of something that had just departed. Next to it was his phone. No, not his phone. Ethan never forgot his phone. That was what made Zora stop. He used to leave it between them on the counter, an harmless object. Now it lived in his pocket or face down on the table at dinner, silent but carrying a private pulse. Early meeting, he texted at 6:12 a.m. Zora read it from the company gym, running on a treadmill in front of a mirrored wall that reflected her own image. Shoulders straight, stride even, heart rate steady. She sent back a heart emoji, out of habit. Nothing was wrong. Just a small shift in the schedule of a busy man. That was what she told herself. The evenings changed too, but so subtly it took time for her to name it. Ethan still came home on time, still kissed her forehead when he walked in, still asked, "How was your day?" Everything was correct, but when she told him about a successful trial, about the first patient diagnosed early by their new AI system, his gaze no longer rested on her the way it used to. He listened. Only his attention felt like a signal with interference, arriving, then slipping away. Sometimes he laughed a beat too late, as if returning from somewhere she couldn't see. Zora noticed it on a Thursday night at their usual Japanese restaurant. Ethan was talking about a new deal, his voice low and confident, as always. Then his phone vibrated softly on the table. He glanced down. Just a glance. but the corner of his mouth curved, not a smile for her, but a private one, contained, like a story only he understood. "Good news?" she asked. He looked up immediately. "Yeah, just a partner confirming the numbers." Smooth. Perfect. But Zora had lived her entire life inside data. She knew when a reaction didn't match its cause. Her work trained her to read the smallest deviations. A biomarker off by 0.2%, a delay in system response, a data set that didn't align with the predictive model. In the lab, those tiny shifts could save a life. In a marriage, they were just a feeling, and feeling was the one variable Zora had always learned to control. She was not a suspicious woman, not because she was naive, but because she believed love, like science, had to be built on trust. Otherwise, it collapsed before it could prove its value. One afternoon, when Palo Alto's sunlight turned the office hallways gold, Zora met Lila in a small conference room. Lila always entered with a calm that made any space fall into order. "You look tired," Lila said, pouring her water. "Just the FDA timeline," Zora replied with a soft smile. "It's getting into my head." Lila tilted her head, her gaze sharp but warm. "You've been living in acceleration mode for 3 years, Zora. No one stays connected to anything at that speed, not even themselves." Zora said nothing. The sentence was gentle, reasonable, and dangerous because it was true. "Ethan feels it too," Lila continued, her voice lowering. "He told me he worries you're carrying too much alone." Zora looked up. "He said that?" Lila nodded. "He doesn't want to add pressure, so he keeps it light when he's with you. That's his way of protecting you." Protecting. The word fell over her like a warm blanket. In that moment, every small doubt dissolved into a familiar guilt. The guilt of a woman always praised for being strong, yet afraid her strength made others feel small. "Maybe I've been too focused," she said quietly. Lila placed a hand over hers. "You're building something that will outlive all of us. It's okay if the personal side contracts a little before it expands again." The language of strategy, the language of reassurance, the language Lila used to turn complexity into logic. Zora exhaled. She believed her, not just because of what she said, but because every year before this had proven Lila stood on her side. If something were wrong, Lila would be the first to tell her. That was the vow. But the micro changes didn't stop. Ethan began taking calls on the balcony at night. His voice lowered, his back turned toward the living room, as if he didn't want to disturb her. Zora couldn't hear the words, only saw his silhouette against the city lights, familiar and suddenly distant. In the bedroom, the distance between them remained the same. No one moved away. There was simply an invisible space neither of them named. He still held her when they slept, but his arm rested across her more lightly, like a gesture learned by memory. One night, Zora woke at 3 a.m. Ethan wasn't in bed. She walked into the living room and saw the glow of his laptop against his face. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He looked up, slightly startled. "Just catching up on emails." She stepped behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. The screen went dark faster than it needed to. Nothing to see, just a reflex that didn't belong to the man who once let her read every important email he sent. Zora returned to bed. She didn't ask another question, not because she didn't want to know, but because for the first time in her life, there was a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Cracks always begin like this, not large enough to name, not clear enough to prove, just enough to make your heart slow for a beat when the other person turns away. Zora moved through her days as usual, presenting, signing deals, saving patients she would never meet. Everything still looked perfect from the outside. Silicon Valley still called them unbreakable. And Zora, the woman who could see the future through streams of data, could not see what was happening inside her own home. Because love, when you believe in it absolutely, does not appear as a system that needs to be audited. It appears as shelter, and no one searches for fractures in the place they call home. That evening began like every other, quiet, orderly, gentle enough to make you believe the world was still moving exactly as it always had. San Francisco lay under a thin layer of fog, the city lights dissolving into watercolor streaks beyond the living room glass. Zora came home later than usual. A regulatory meeting had run over. When she opened the door, Ethan was already there, sleeves rolled, standing at the stove, as if he had never left that familiar position. "Have you eaten?" he asked, turning toward her, his smile warm enough to erase the fatigue in her body. Zora nodded, set her bag down, walked toward him. The smell of tomato sauce and basil filled the air. Things like this had once been her definition of happiness. Not the galas, not the contracts, but the simple fact that someone was waiting for her to come home. They ate under soft, golden light, talking about ordinary things. Ethan described a new founder the fund was considering. Zora spoke about the first patient whose pancreatic cancer had been detected early by their AI system. Their conversations still wove together seamlessly, like two data streams designed to be compatible. Nothing was wrong. No signs, until Ethan stood, took off his jacket, and tossed it lightly over the back of a chair. The sound, a soft drop, should have meant nothing, but it landed heavier than usual, as if something were inside the pocket. Zora didn't look immediately. She kept drinking her water, listening to him talk about next week's flight schedule. But her mind, trained to detect the smallest deviation, had already registered it. A thin, rectangular shape. Not his phone. His phone was on the table. Not his wallet. That always stayed in his pants pocket. An object that did not exist in Ethan's habitual system. After they cleared the table, he went into the bathroom. The sound of running water, steady, consistent. Zora stood alone in the living room. The jacket was still there. She had no intention of checking it. Truly, she walked past it, meaning only to hang it up like she always did. But when her hand touched the fabric, the presence of the object inside became clearer. A hard edge, thin, positioned somewhere unfamiliar. In science, when you see data that doesn't fit, you don't call it betrayal. You call it an anomaly, something that needs to be understood. Zora slipped her hand into the pocket, just to hang the jacket properly, that was all. Her fingers touched a smooth surface. A card. She pulled it out. Not a bank card, not a business card. A key card, black, matte, the name engraved in silver. The Halcyon House, a private members club. Zora stood still. She knew the place, not because she had ever been, but because Lila had once mentioned it, one night over wine after a successful campaign. Lila had laughed, swirling her glass. Only people who are changing their lives go there. It's not a place, it's a decision. They had been talking about CEOs restructuring their companies, about middle-aged men leaving their wives to start over. They had laughed. Zora had laughed. She remembered it clearly, because Lila rarely spoke about spaces that intimate. Zora turned the card over. In the lower corner, very small, almost like a pen test, were the letters LH, two initials. Instinctively, her mind began searching for alternative explanations. LH could be anything. A partner, a founder, a project name. She repeated the possibilities the way she tested a hypothesis, but her body didn't believe them, because Lila's voice still existed in her memory. If you ever need privacy in this city. The water in the bathroom kept running, steady, unchanged. Zora placed the card on the kitchen counter under the white light. She looked at it the way she looked at a sample in the lab, not as a wife, not as a woman, but as a scientist. She took out her phone, took a picture, then another, closer, then one more, with the wall clock in the frame. Time, data, evidence. She didn't know what she was preparing for, only that something deeper than emotion was guiding her. She returned the card to the pocket, exactly where it had been, hung the jacket up, wiped the counter. When Ethan came out, his hair still damp, he looked at her the way he always did. "You tired?" Zora turned. "No," she said, and realized her voice was calm, in a way that felt almost dangerous. He stepped closer and kissed her cheek. His familiar cologne, but beneath it, something else. Very faint, white wood, bergamot, and something cold, like the lobby of a luxury hotel. Not the scent of his office, not the gym, not anywhere in the schedule he had told her. Zora smiled. "I'm going upstairs." That night they lay beside each other, as they always did. The distance between them, unchanged. Ethan's arm still resting across her, his breathing steady, as if nothing were different, as if the key card had never existed. Zora lay awake in the dark. The familiar ceiling, city light breaking into blurred lines above them. Her heart was not racing. It didn't hurt. It was something else, cold and precise. Not sadness, not jealousy, recognition. A system that had once been perfect had just produced a variable that did not belong. And the most dangerous thing was not the keycard. It was the fact that she knew exactly what to do with it. She didn't cry, didn't turn to question him, didn't check his phone. Zora simply lay there, eyes open, listening to the breathing of the man the world believed was her destiny. And for the first time in her life, she understood what a patient feels when they see test results before the doctor explains them. There is no diagnosis yet, but you know, something has changed permanently. The keycard in his pocket was not proof of betrayal. Not yet. It was only an object that did not belong in their marriage. And because it was small, silent, incapable of speaking for itself, it became the most dangerous thing in the room. Because the things that break your life rarely begin with an explosion. They begin with something small, still, resting in the pocket of the person you trust the most. The next morning, everything unfolded exactly the way a perfect marriage is supposed to. Ethan woke up 15 minutes before her, made coffee, opened the curtains, letting sunlight flood the living room. He placed a cup of tea on Zora's nightstand, the right temperature, the exact blend she preferred on days filled with long meetings. Those gestures were not fake, and precisely because they were real, they hurt in a more refined way. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, leaning down to kiss her hair. Zora opened her eyes and looked at him the way she always had, calm, gentle, with no sign of the storm that had passed through her during the night. "I did," she said. That was the moment she understood she would not ask. Not because she feared the answer, but because she knew one thing: questions are power. And when you ask too early, you hand that power to someone else. Zora went to work as usual. In the glass conference room on the 17th floor, she presented a model predicting post-operative complications, her voice steady, her slides appearing like measured heartbeats. No one in the room knew that inside her mind, another system had been activated. Not an AI system, an observation system. She began with the smallest things, the details a wife would overlook, but a scientist never would. Schedules. Ethan had always shared his calendar, not because she asked, but because that was how they functioned, like partners. Zora opened it during lunch, not searching, just reading. The meetings were still there, correctly labeled, properly timed, but new empty blocks had appeared. Not large, just 1-hour windows marked personal hold. Ethan had never used that phrase before. He named everything specifically: data room review, partner sync, founder dinner. Personal hold was a vague concept, a space without data, a zone the system could not analyze. Zora memorized the times. No screenshots, no messages to anyone, just memory. The way she had once memorized the structure of DNA in her freshman year. That evening, while Ethan showered, his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. Not a long vibration, just one pulse. Zora was slicing fruit. She didn't look immediately. She set the knife down, dried her hands, then looked. Just a calendar notification. No content, only 2 letters. LH, 7:30 p.m. Her heart did not race. She did not touch the phone. Did not open it, just looked. Those 2 letters, the same as on the key card. A coincidence or a pattern. In science, when 2 data points align, you don't conclude. You wait for the third. Zora began noticing things she had never paid attention to before. Small charges in their joint account, not large amounts. A dinner in Nob Hill. At the exact hour Ethan had said he was still at the office. An Uber ride to a neighborhood where they knew no one. Reimbursements from the fund, carefully categorized under client hospitality. Everything was logical, nothing illegal, just not part of the life she knew. Zora did not take screenshots, did not print statements. She opened a small leather notebook, the one Ethan had given her on their 3rd anniversary. "Write the things that matter," he had said. She began to write. Not emotions, not suspicions, only date, time, location, description. A scientist never records conclusions before there is enough data. Lila remained in her life exactly as before. Strategy meetings, text messages, drink water. You forget when you're stressed. Your interview is trending. Proud of you. Perfect care. One afternoon, they sat at their usual cafe. Lila wore a cream coat, her hair tied low, her eyes reading Zora as quickly as always. "You look centered again," Lila said. "Am I?" Zora smiled. "You just needed to slow down. I told you, nothing was wrong." Nothing was wrong. The sentence passed like smoke. Zora watched her. The way she held her coffee in her left hand, the thin gold ring, Zora's gift when Lila was promoted. The way she avoided mentioning Ethan. They had always spoken about him before, like 3 points of a perfect triangle. Now Ethan had become a zone of silence. Not forbidden, just untouched. Another variable. Zora did not follow, did not hire a private investigator, did not ask questions. She observed. She noticed Ethan was lighter on certain evenings. The way he walked into the house, shoulders relaxed, his smile more real. Not because of her, because part of him had been nourished somewhere else. She noticed Lila canceling strategy meetings on the same days Ethan had a personal hold. She noticed the fund's travel schedule aligning with the client retreats Lila mentioned. Never the same flight, never the same hotel. A system designed not to be detected. Not a mistake, a structure. That night, Zora spread the notebook across the dining table. Short lines, even spacing. From a distance, nothing. Disconnected dates, numbers, initials. But when she stepped back, the way she did when analyzing a large data set, the pattern appeared. A second life, running parallel to hers, never touching, never overlapping, optimized. Zora sat down, her hands resting flat on the table, and she understood something she had never considered before. This was not an affair driven by emotion. This was an operation, managed by calendar, by finance, by narrative, and that said more than any love message ever could. She did not cry, did not rage, only one thought, clear as a line of code that had just executed. They didn't think she would see it. They believed the woman who lived by data would never analyze her own marriage. Zora closed the notebook. In the silent room, the city lights reflected across the glass like a neural network. She stood there for a long time, and in that moment, she was no longer a wife being betrayed. She became the person the world feared, a woman with enough information, enough patience, and enough composure to do nothing until nothing could be denied. She did not confront, because confrontation is an ending, and she had only just begun to observe. There are nights when the city stops being the place you live and becomes a vast mirror reflecting the truth you've been postponing. That night, San Francisco was wrapped in a layer of silk-thin fog. Light from the high-rises dissolved into the damp air, turning everything into soft streaks of brightness, almost tender. It was the kind of evening meant for promises, for dates, for returning home. Zora parked a block away from the Halcyon house. Not too close, not too far. A quiet street, lined with perfectly spaced trees that filtered the light. Luxury cars resting along the curb like carefully kept secrets. She turned off the engine. No music, no phone. She sat there with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, as if waiting for a signal she already knew would come. She wasn't dressed for the occasion. A long beige coat, hair tied low, no more makeup than usual. Not because she wanted to disappear, but because she hadn't come as a wife. She had come as a witness. A black car stopped at the entrance to the club. Zora recognized it even from a distance. The car Ethan used for important meetings. The door opened. He stepped out. It was Ethan. Tall, composed, wearing the dark gray coat she had helped him choose during their winter trip to New York. He stood there for a moment, as he always did, adjusted his cuff, looked around. Not the glance of someone nervous, the glance of a man accustomed to everything being exactly where it should be. Then he walked inside. No hesitation, no rush, as if he had passed through that door many times before. Zora didn't blink. Her heart didn't shatter the way it does in films. There was no music, no dizziness, only a strange sensation. The feeling of a hypothesis long known finally being confirmed. 9:16 p.m. Another car pulled up. Silver. The door opened. Lila stepped out, elegant as always. The long cream coat, brown hair tied low, heels making soft sounds against the pavement. She paused in front of the glass, looking at her reflection. A gesture so familiar, so Lila, as if always checking whether the story she was telling the world was still perfect. Zora remembered that gesture. There had been hundreds of times she stood beside Lila in the restrooms of major events, watching Lila fix her lipstick and say, "You're not just entering the room, you're defining it." Lila walked in, 3 minutes after Ethan. Perfect distance, perfect timing, a choreography that had been rehearsed. Zora took out her phone, raised it from far enough away not to intrude, close enough to identify. The club entrance, the metal lettering of the name, the time on her screen. One shot, then another. She didn't zoom. Her hands didn't shake. Her fingers were as steady as when she held a scalpel in the lab. When she was done, she lowered the phone, didn't move closer, didn't try to look inside, because she didn't need to. Certainty does not come from seeing two people touch. It comes from watching two trajectories converge at the same point. She stayed there for a few more minutes. The night wind slipped through the cracked window, carrying the scent of the bay. In her mind, images from the past appeared, not as a flood, but like slow-moving slides. Lila standing behind her at her wedding, hand resting lightly at her back before she walked down the aisle. Ethan looking at her during her first interview, pride in his eyes. The three of them laughing in a bright kitchen, a bottle of wine open between them. Those moments were still real, still existed. They just were no longer the whole truth. Her phone vibrated. A message from Lila. "Thinking of you. Don't work too late tonight." Zora looked at the text for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it was perfect. Still the tone of care, still the precise timing, still the narrative Lila always maintained. She locked the screen, set the phone down, did not reply. For the first time since everything began, Zora exhaled. Not the breath of someone who had lost something, the breath of someone who had found something. Clarity. She understood that from this moment on, the story had changed. Before, everything had been data, patterns, hypotheses, anomalies. Now it was truth, undeniable, impossible to gaslight, impossible to reinterpret with elegant psychological language. She was no longer the wife who suspected. She was the only person in the story who knew exactly what was happening. Zora started the car, did not look back at the club, did not wait for them to come out. Because the important moment was not when they entered together. It was when she left alone with a new version of herself. At a red light, the glow illuminated the rearview mirror. She saw her own face, the same calm eyes, no sign of a life collapsing. And in that moment, a sentence formed in her mind. Clear, cold, precise as a final line of code. Emotion is their language. Pattern is mine. She did not cry that night. Not while driving home, not when she opened the penthouse door, still lit. Ethan wasn't back yet. The room was silent. Everything in its place, the leather chair, the glass she had used that morning, the book she was halfway through. Her life was still there. Only her marriage was not. And the strangest thing was, Zora did not feel like she had lost something. She felt as if she had stepped into a new space, where everything, finally, belonged to her. That night, when she lay down, she slept. A deep, dreamless sleep. Because uncertainty, the thing that exhausts people most, was gone. The pain could come later. The anger could come later. The grief could come later. But that night, there was only one thing: certainty. And inside that certainty, another version of Zora Bennett was born. Not the woman who had been betrayed, but the woman who knew exactly when her story truly began. The morning after that night, San Francisco woke as if nothing in the structure of the world had shifted. Trains moved along Market Street, cafes opened with the warm scent of roasted beans. Young founders sat in front of laptops, believing they were rewriting the future. Zora Bennett walked into her office in the glass building overlooking the bay, greeted everyone as she always did, signed 2 documents, answered 3 questions about the FDA timeline, and attended a meeting that lasted exactly 37 minutes. No one knew she had stood outside a private club the night before and watched her marriage end in silence. Because Zora did not carry the truth like a wound. She carried it like a structure. The meeting was at 7 in the evening in a place the press never photographed. Not a restaurant, not an office. A private conference room in an old building in Jackson Square. Dark wood walls, low lighting, a long table meant for 8, but today holding only 3. The woman who arrived before Zora was Marianne Holt, a governance attorney known in the investment world as a voice that never needed to be raised. Silver hair in a precise knot, navy suit, a leather notebook aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. The second was Daniel Reeves, a crisis strategist who had made a billion-dollar scandal disappear from the media in 2 weeks without anyone understanding how. They did not stand to greet her. They nodded. The way people do when they understand emotion is not invited into this room. Zora sat down, placed her bag on the table. Inside was the leather notebook. Not evidence in the legal sense. A timeline, dates, hours, points of intersection. Marianne opened it. She did not ask, "Are you okay?" She did not say, "I'm sorry this happened." The only question, "What do you want to protect?" Zora answered immediately. Daniel looked up. "In that order?" "Yes." No hesitation. Not a single word about Ethan. Only structure. Marianne turned the pages. Dates, times, locations. No emotion. Only pattern. "Good," she said. One word. But in her voice, recognition. "You didn't confront." "No." "Perfect." Because confrontation destroys a case. Confrontation creates a story, and stories can be spun. Data exists independently of narrative. Daniel leaned back. "Right now," he said, "this is not an affair." Zora met his gaze. "This is a governance risk." The frame shifted. Gravity moved. No longer, "He betrayed you." Now, "He compromised institutional trust." No longer, "She stole your husband." Now, "She violated professional neutrality while holding strategic access." In the world of power, personal morality is a story. Conflict of interest is a death sentence. Daniel pulled the laptop toward him. On the screen, a map. Lines connecting points. Ethan, fund decisions, advisory introductions, expense pathways. Lila, brand strategy, crisis positioning, access to confidential narratives. Zora looked at it and, for the first time, saw her marriage inside a system she understood. Not emotion, risk. Daniel said, "If this goes public as infidelity, it becomes gossip. If it enters an ethics committee as fiduciary breach, it becomes consequence." Consequence, a word without drama, but heavy with the possibility of losing everything. Marianne closed the notebook. "You don't move emotionally," she said. "You move at an inflection point." Zora knew exactly what her inflection point was. Regulatory approval. The moment her company would become indispensable. The moment any personal instability could be used to shake market confidence. If she spoke now, she would be the woman who lost control. If she waited, she would be the one protecting the system. The difference was timing. Silence settled in the room. Not tense, not heavy. The quiet of people who could see the entire board. Daniel studied her for a moment. "You understand," he said slowly, "this will end their careers." Zora did not blink. "I'm not ending anything," she replied. "I'm documenting what already exists." Marianne nodded. "Then we proceed." They began discussing process. No language of revenge. Only confidential ethics packet timeline verification, public source evidence, institutional liability. Zora listened. Memorized. Did not ask how Ethan would feel. Did not ask what Lila would say. Because for the first time in the entire story, the center was no longer them. The center was her. She was no longer a wife losing something. She was a founder protecting a structure. When the meeting ended, Daniel said, "You're not here to destroy them." Zora stood. "Correct. You're here to prevent erasure." She put on her coat. The yellow light reflected across the wooden table, where her leather notebook rested. once a gift of love, now a tool. She looked at Daniel. The goal, she said, her voice calm enough to be almost gentle, is to make sure the truth arrives before they rewrite it. Outside, the city was still bright. Couples walked past, hand in hand. High-rise windows reflected the night sky like grids of data. Zora stepped out of the building. No sense of victory, no grief, only alignment, the feeling of an algorithm finally running correctly. That night, for the first time since everything began, she did not think about Ethan on the way home. She did not think about Lila. She thought about the meeting, the structure, the timing, the way a truth, placed in the right position, could change an entire narrative without a single accusation. The war room was not a place for planning destruction. It was the place where a woman learned to step out of someone else's story and begin writing her own in the language power is forced to hear. Dưới đây là bản dịch sang English, chuẩn văn phong Mỹ, social tension, power shift, narrative war đúng tinh thần part 8. The city starts choosing sides. No article was published, no press release, no scandal. And because of that, the city began to shift. San Francisco is a place where rumors move faster than data, not through accusations, but through pauses in greetings, through a meeting that gets rescheduled, through an email that no longer receives a reply within 5 minutes. Zora noticed it on a Monday morning when she walked into her usual cafe on Sand Hill Road. The barista still smiled, still called her by name, still made her oolong tea exactly the way she liked. But the woman in front of her, a venture partner who used to start conversations every time they met, today only gave a small nod, her gaze sliding past Zora as if she were moving behind a pane of invisible glass. Not cold, just careful. At the office, the changes were more subtle. Her board chair requested an informal check-in. His voice was still warm, but his language had been selected with precision. We just want to make sure you're supported during this intense phase. Supported. A beautiful word. A word that means, we are watching you. Zora sat across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table, her voice steady. She spoke about the regulatory timeline, the pipeline, the hiring plan. No one in the room mentioned Ethan. No one mentioned Lila. But Zora understood that in systems of power, people don't need to say what they are thinking. They measure your response to questions that are not related. Are you getting enough rest? Do you feel the pressure is manageable? She smiled. Pressure is the only environment innovation survives in. An answer they could enter into the minutes. An answer that left no opening for another narrative. At evening events, the shift became clearer. Zora entered a fundraising gala in Nob Hill. The room still bright, jazz still drifting, champagne still glittering. But the circle around her was smaller. Conversations shorter. Glances that lingered a moment too long. Not curious, evaluating. Silicon Valley never asks, is it true? They ask, is she stable? And across the room, Lila. Still perfect, still elegant, still the invisible thread connecting groups of people. She stood beside two journalists, smiling softly, her hand resting on the arm of a female founder mid-conversation. When their eyes met, Lila smiled. It was not a victorious smile, not provocative, just normal, as if nothing had changed between them. And that normalcy made everyone else feel, if something had happened, it probably wasn't Lila's fault. Ethan still appeared beside Zora at events, still placed his hand at her back, still spoke about her vision. But there was a small difference. He began to be seen with sympathy. You must be so proud of her. You're handling this phase so gracefully. Gracefully. Zora recognized the narrative being written, not through Ethan's words, through his silence. By allowing others to speak for him, a patient man, a supportive husband standing beside an overwhelmed woman, an image that is easy to believe, an image everyone recognizes. Lila appeared in places Zora did not attend. A panel on brand ethics, a podcast about navigating founder burnout. She said perfect sentences. High-performing women often forget to take care of their emotional infrastructure. Support systems matter more than success. No one could disagree. No one could call it an implication. But every sentence became a thin layer of fog over Zora's image. Brilliant, but overwhelmed. Visionary, but fragile. Zora began receiving messages. Not hostile. Worse, concern. Thinking of you. Let's have lunch soon. You look like you need a break. Maybe step back a little after the FDA decision. You've been running nonstop. A longtime friend sent her the number of a well-known therapist in the founder community. Just in case. Just in case. 3 words with the weight of a conclusion. At home, Ethan was the same. He asked about her day. He cooked. He told gentle stories. But Zora began to understand something. He no longer needed to lie, because the external narrative was doing it for him. He only needed to be silent. And in that silence, he became the sympathetic man in a marriage with a woman too powerful for her own balance. One evening, Zora drove across the Golden Gate, fog heavy, the light posts appearing and disappearing. This city, the place where she had built everything, now felt like a network recalibrating itself. Nodes choosing positions. Connections shifting. Not because they knew the truth, because they sensed imbalance. In systems of power, people don't wait for evidence. They choose sides based on who appears more stable, who appears safer, who represents less risk. Zora pulled over at a lookout above the city, lights stretching like a neural map. She remembered Marianne's question in the war room. What do you want to protect? And she understood this was not a battle about love, not about betrayal. It was about narrative. If she spoke too early, she would be the woman who lost control. If she stayed silent too long, the story would be finished without her. The city was choosing sides. No announcements, no noise, but unmistakably. For the first time in her life, Zora felt a pressure different from any she had ever carried. Not the pressure of saving a company, not the pressure of changing an industry, the pressure of proving she was still worthy of trust. She stood there for a long time. The wind from the bay grew stronger. Her hair came loose from its clip. She didn't fix it, didn't hide. She looked down at the same city that had once called her an icon, now watching her like a variable. And in that moment, Zora understood. Silence was no longer patience. Silence was beginning to look like a confession she had never made. The battle was no longer inside her marriage. It was inside the perception of an entire ecosystem. And if she did not step in at the exact right moment, the truth would not be denied. It would be replaced. Power rarely begins with a declaration. It begins with a door that no longer opens the way it used to. That morning, Zora's penthouse felt brighter than usual. Not because of the sunlight, but because everything in the room had been reset, as if an invisible hand had reorganized the entire architecture of a life. Ethan's coat was no longer draped over the chair. His shoes were no longer near the door. There was no second coffee cup beside her tea. He still lived there, but the intimate traces, the things that turn a space into us, were gone. Zora stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the 2 boxes on the table. Not large, not ornate, just pale gray boxes wrapped in white tissue. No names, no notes, no emotion. She closed the first box. Inside were the things Ethan had given her over 6 years. The round-faced watch from Geneva after her Series B closed. The fountain pen engraved, "For the life you're building." The leather notebook, the same one she had used to document his timeline. She placed each item carefully, not like she was giving them back, like she was archiving them. Each object set down like a period at the end of a sentence. At the bottom, she placed a sheet of paper. Not a letter, a timeline, date, time, location, no conclusion, no accusation, just the structure of a truth. The second box was smaller, lighter, but it took longer to complete. Zora opened the drawer in her study. Lila's silk scarf was still there, forgotten after a night they had worked until 2 in the morning. The sneakers they had bought together in Boston, when Lila had said they needed to live outside the narrative for a weekend. A book on women in leadership, with Lila's note inside. You don't just enter rooms, you change their temperature. Zora placed each item inside, slowly, precisely. Not because they were heavy, because they had been real. On top, she laid the vow keeper bracelet, the thin gold band Zora had fastened around Lila's wrist on her wedding day. The day Lila stood behind her and promised to protect the marriage, even when Zora couldn't see the cracks. The bracelet still shone, unmarked, unbroken. Like the vow, she closed the box. No private courier, no secret messenger, just a standard delivery service. Both boxes were sent that same morning, one to Ethan's condo, one to Lila's office. Timing, like everything else, calculated. Ethan received his at 9:08 a.m. The concierge signed for it, left it at his door. He opened it after returning from a meeting that had been cut short for reasons he didn't yet understand. The objects looked back at him like earlier versions of himself. The nights he had said they would build an empire, the red-eye flights, the promises, the timeline at the bottom. No title, no explanation, just data he knew was accurate. He sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in months, there was no narrative he could use, no story he could tell, because Zora had said nothing. And her silence, structured in data, was stronger than any accusation. Lila, in the middle of a glass-walled office, among people working, the courier asked for a signature, a fraction of hesitation, just enough for 3 nearby heads to lift. Lila smiled, signed, closed her office door, opened the box, the scarf, the sneakers, the book, each object a fragment of a story she believed she controlled. Then the bracelet, on top, bright, silent, no word. No. Lila understood immediately. This was not exposure, not a threat. This was loss of access. Access, the thing that had allowed her into the deepest layers of Zora's life, had been revoked. No argument, no dialogue, no appeal. That afternoon, the city began to shift. No news, no announcements. But Ethan received an email. Meeting moved to next week. A message. We'll circle back. A call that wasn't returned. Lila received. Client needs time to review alignment. Let's pause for now. Her calendar began to open. Not cancellation, just no longer being filled. Zora did not monitor. She did not call. She did not text. That evening, she stayed home, alone. She cooked dinner for one. Opened her laptop. The clinical trial report. Outside, the city still glowed. Inside, everything was quiet. No more waiting, no more observing, only clarity. Access is not just the ability to enter a room. It is the right to define the story. Ethan and Lila had lived inside her story, used her structure, operated within her system. And that morning, without a single word, Zora did the thing they never expected. She removed them from it. Not with anger, not with drama, with a simple act, returning everything. Night fell. Zora stood on the balcony. The city spread beneath her. She lifted her hand, the wedding ring still there. Not removed, not yet. Because the ring was not access. It was a symbol, and symbols must end on the right stage. Today was not about symbols. Today was about structure, about a woman stepping out of a system others used to control her, and rebuilding it in a way that no longer had room for them. The night wind moved through her hair. No tears, no emptiness, only a strange lightness, like a room that had just been cleared, like a door that had just closed, not to keep someone out, but to protect what remained inside. Access is revoked. No announcement, irreversible. And from that moment forward, the story was no longer about what they had done. It was about who she decided was allowed to exist in her world. Power systems do not collapse with noise. They change temperature. On Thursday morning, Zora arrived at the office earlier than usual. The city was still wrapped in a thin layer of fog, light reflecting off glass buildings like streams of unread data. There was an email from Marianne in her inbox. No long subject line, no explanation, just one sentence. It has been submitted. Zora read it twice, not because she didn't understand, but because she recognized that this moment, small enough that no one but her would notice, was the point where everything began to move. The ethics packet had entered the system. No press, no social media, no one knew. But the places that needed to know, knew. The first domino did not fall immediately. It tilted. That same morning, Ethan received a call. Zora knew not because he told her, but because when he walked into the living room that night, his shoulders were tighter than usual. Long day? She asked, her voice as gentle as always. Yeah, he said, setting down his laptop. Internal review. just routine. Routine, a word Ethan had used his entire life to reassure other people. This time it landed between them like an object that did not belong in the room. He did not look into her eyes when he said it. A small detail, but enough. At the firm, Ethan's calendar began to change. Meetings were no longer in the large glass conference rooms. They were moved into smaller ones. No assistants, no founders, only partners. Doors closed. No agenda, just a title. Mandatory attendance. In venture capital, that is how they say, "We are evaluating you." Lila felt it before anyone said anything. A contract she had spent 3 months preparing was delayed for alignment. An old client replied to her email with a single line, "Let's revisit next quarter." An associate asked during a team meeting, "Should we update our disclosure policy regarding personal proximity to key stakeholders?" A professional question, completely reasonable. But when Lila answered, she realized her voice was half a beat slower than usual. For the first time in years, she did not control the narrative instantly. Zora did nothing. That was the hardest part. She still attended meetings, still gave presentations, still answered interviews about ethical AI, still stood on stage under white light, her face calm. In every photo, she was still Dr. Zora Bennett, the woman the city trusted. No one could point to a single visible sign of the war happening beneath the surface. Because this war did not require her presence. It was unfolding in boardrooms she never entered, in emails she never had to send, in calls she never had to take. Friday afternoon, the second email arrived from Marianne. Temporary leave initiated. Zora sat in her office, looking out at the bay. Waves struck the shore in a steady rhythm. Ethan had been placed on temporary leave. The official language would be pending review. A phrase without emotion, but in his world, it was the power of being pulled from the entire network. Deal flow stopped. Founders stopped calling. Other partners led the meetings. Authority, the thing that had once been part of his body, disappeared inside a paragraph. That night, Ethan came home early. No laptop, no calls. He sat on the sofa, staring at the TV without turning it on. Zora stood in the kitchen, pouring water. The distance between them had not changed. But for the first time in months, he looked like a man searching for something without knowing where to find it. "They're just being cautious," he said, as if speaking to himself. "Of course," Zora replied. No sarcasm, no victory, just the truth. He was saying a sentence he needed to believe. Across the city, Lila sat alone in her dark office. Her calendar was emptying. Not because meetings were being canceled, because they were not being rescheduled. Silence. The thing she had once used to contain other people's crises now surrounded her. She opened her laptop, closed it, checked her phone. No new messages. For the first time, she did not know what story was being told about her. Zora realized the strangest thing in all of this. She did not feel happy. She did not feel revenge. It felt like when a flawed system is finally corrected, not because you hate the flaw, but because it distorts the entire structure. She did not destroy Ethan's life. She did not ruin Lila's career. She placed a truth exactly where it belonged. And the system, like any system designed to protect itself, responded. That night, Zora worked late. She reread the clinical trial report, signed a new contract, replied to an email from a young female founder asking for advice. Her life, the one they had treated as the background to their story, continued forward at unchanged speed. When she turned off the office lights and looked into the glass, her reflection was not a betrayed woman. It was a founder who had passed through an inflection point. The first domino had fallen. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift in gravity. And what Ethan and Lila were beginning to understand, slowly, painfully, inevitably, was this. Once a system moves into protection mode, it does not return to its previous state. No call can fix it. No explanation is enough. Because this is no longer a story about love. This is a story about trust. And in their world, once it is lost permanently. No one ever steps out of a power system without triggering a counterforce. Dominoes do not fall in only one direction. They create shock waves. And in the world of narrative, shock waves always try to travel back to where they began. 3 days after Ethan was placed on temporary leave, the city began to talk. Not through articles, not through statements, through stories told in rooms with no recording devices. A lunch in Menlo Park, a panel that ran late, a glass of wine after work. Sentences that began with, "I don't know if this is true, but," and ended with, "She's been under a lot of pressure lately." Zora noticed it during a board meeting. One of the members, the same man who once called her the most stable founder we've ever backed, asked, "Are you sleeping enough?" The question had nothing to do with financials, nothing to do with the regulatory timeline, but it sat there in the middle of the meeting like ink spilled on white paper. Zora answered calmly, "I operate best under structured pressure." Heads nodded. Notes were taken. No one objected. But she knew the narrative was moving. Lila disappeared from public view for a few days, and then she returned. Not with a statement, with a podcast interview about sustainable leadership for women in power. She wore a simple white blouse, minimal makeup, that low, warm voice people always trusted. "I've seen so many brilliant women burn out because they feel they have to be everything at once," Lila said. "Visionary, CEO, partner, public symbol." She paused, just long enough for the sentence to carry weight. "And when they start losing balance, the people around them often don't know how to help." No names, no accusations, just a story. A story everyone knew was about someone. Messages began arriving for Zora. Not hostile, not direct. Concern. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Maybe take a break after the approval. Your health matters more than the company." An investor sent her the number of an executive coach. An old friend sent an article about high-functioning anxiety in female founders. No one said she was losing control, but everyone was preparing for the possibility. At home, Ethan began to speak more. Not about the case, not about the review, about her. "People are worried about you," he said one evening, standing at the kitchen doorway, his voice soft, as if caring for something fragile. "You've been carrying too much for too long." Zora looked at him, and she recognized the most subtle thing of all. He wasn't lying. He was telling a story that had been handed to him, a story in which he was the patient husband, Lila was the concerned friend, and Zora, the woman too strong to admit she was exhausted. It was a perfect narrative because it had logic, and logic is always easier to believe than truth. The counterattack did not come through evidence. It came through imagery. A photo from a networking event. Lila standing beside two young female founders, her hand lightly resting on their shoulders. Caption: "Protect your energy. Success should not cost your soul." Hundreds of likes. Comments: "You're such a safe space. Thank you for speaking about burnout." A LinkedIn post from an industry partner. "We need to create environments where high-performing leaders can step back without stigma." No tag, but everyone knew. In power systems, you don't have to destroy a person. You only have to introduce a question about their stability. You only have to make people ask, "Is she okay?" And once that question exists, trust begins to shift. Zora saw the entire structure. She recognized Lila's brilliance. This was not a personal attack. This was a repositioning. If Ethan was being framed as a liability, Lila became someone pulled into the damage. If Zora was framed as unstable, the entire narrative flipped. Zora was no longer the protector of the system. She became the risk. Marianne called that evening. "They're reframing," she said. "I know. Do you want to respond?" Zora stood on the balcony, looking down at the city. Lights stretched like a neural map. "No." Marianne was silent for a moment. "Good." Because a reaction was exactly what this narrative needed. A long post, an emotional interview, one visible loss of control. Just one. And the entire structure Zora had built would collapse. That night, she opened the timeline notebook again, not to add data, to remember. She reread the dates, the intersections, the patterns. That was the truth, not the story. Truth does not need to be loud. It only needs to exist. The most powerful part of their counterattack was not what they said. It was how they understood Zora. They thought she would get angry, respond, explain, prove. They thought she would step into the narrative they created. But they forgot one thing. Zora does not live by narrative. She lives by structure. The next morning, She appeared in an interview about ethical AI. The host asked, "How do you stay grounded when the pressure is everywhere?" Zora smiled. "Systems survive because they don't react to noise. They respond to signal." The answers spread. Not directly, not aimed at anyone, but enough. A reminder. She was not the one losing control. She was the one waiting for the right moment. The counterattack had begun. The narrative was moving. The city was watching. Two stories now existed in parallel. A story about an overwhelmed woman. A story about a woman protecting the truth. And what no one but Zora knew was this. She did not need to win this war with words, because this war would not be decided by who spoke better. It would be decided by the moment the truth entered the room. There is a moment in every power war when you realize that truth, on its own, is not enough. What decides everything is who tells it first. That morning, the San Francisco sky was so clear it felt almost cold. Light poured over the glass towers like a curtain with nowhere for shadows to hide. Zora stood by her office window, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold, watching the movement below like streams of data inside a system she understood too well. The narrative out there was still running. Articles about founder burnout. Conversations about the emotional cost of leadership. Sympathetic looks every time she entered a room. No one called her weak. They were simply preparing for the possibility. And that was the most sophisticated strategy of all. Daniel's email arrived at 8:03. No long subject line, just one sentence. Window opens in 48 hours. Regulatory approval for her company's final clinical trial phase would be announced in 2 days. The moment when every investor, every major fund, every tech publication would turn toward Zora. The moment when she would no longer be a founder, but a system. If the wrong narrative existed before that point, it would attach to her name like an annotation that could never be removed. If the truth arrived at the exact right time, it would become the definition. The war room opened again. Dark wood walls, low amber light. Marianne placed a thin folder in front of her. "Public source only," she said. Not a single line from a private phone. Not a hidden recording. Not one piece of data that could be called invasive. Only overlapping meeting timelines, undisclosed disclosure conflicts, financial pathways aligned with private access schedules, role overlaps in deals requiring neutrality, not scandal, governance. Daniel slid a page toward her. A screenshot, a message, not between Ethan and Lila, between Lila and a client. "I'll handle the narrative internally." The timestamp matched the day Zora had been called into the informal board check-in. One sentence, one moment, a coincidence that in this world is called influence. Zora looked at it for a long time, not because she hesitated, because she understood this was the point where her story stopped being personal. It became institutional. If this file entered the system, no one could call her emotional. No one could call her unstable. Emotion cannot produce pattern. Only structure can. "Once it's released," Daniel said, "you don't speak." Zora nodded. No interview, no post, no explanation, because the one who controls the story is not the one who talks the most. It is the one who makes the system speak for them. 2 days later, the regulatory announcement was published. Zora's name appeared across every major tech outlet. Bennett AI achieves final approval. Historic moment for ethical medical systems. The future of healthcare just changed. The city and the world turned toward her. And at that exact moment, Ethan's firm's ethics committee released an internal notice. No mention of Zora, no scandal, only formal review initiated regarding undisclosed conflicts affecting investment neutrality. At the same time, 2 of Lila's largest clients announced a pause in collaboration to review governance alignment. No drama, no accusations, just the system protecting itself. The news moved the way Silicon Valley always moves. Fast, precise, emotionless. On one panel, people stopped mentioning burnout. In another board meeting, the question was no longer, "Is Zora okay?" It became, "How did this governance breach happen?" The narrative flipped. Not because Zora spoke, because structure did. Lila understood first. She sent a message. The first in weeks. We need to talk. Zora read it. Did not reply. Not because she had nothing to say, but because the conversation had ended long ago. Lila just didn't know it yet. That night, Ethan stood in the living room, looking at Zora as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a wife, not as a partner, as a system he no longer had access to. They're saying this is about governance, he said. Zora set down her glass of water. It is. Her voice was not raised, not cold, just true. For the first time, there was no narrative he could use, no way to turn this into something personal, because it had moved beyond love. It had become trust. And trust, in their world, is not an emotion. It is currency. Once lost, it cannot be called back. The city changed in a single day. The sympathetic looks disappeared. The advice about rest stopped. Meetings returned with clear agendas. Zora walked into a room and felt gravity back in its original place. No one apologized. No one needed to. In power systems, a narrative shift is the apology. That night, Zora came home late. She stood on the balcony, looking down at the same city that had chosen sides before knowing the truth. The wind moved through her hair. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Marianne. Story stabilized. Zora smiled, not because she had won, but because the story had finally returned to its rightful owner. Control of the story is not about saying everything. It is about placing the truth at the one moment when no one can rewrite it. And in that moment, she understood. They had tried to turn her into a chapter in their story, but in the end, the entire story had to pass through her in order to exist. That moment, the one people would later describe with words like iconic, historic, unforgettable, began for Zora with something very small, the sound of the zipper on a black dress. The afternoon before the event, the penthouse was so quiet she could hear the city in the distance, like a constant current underneath everything. The dress hung in front of the window, light sliding across the fabric, creating sharp lines, minimal, unadorned, uninterested in impressing. She didn't choose it because it was beautiful. She chose it because it told no story except the one she was bringing with her. In the dressing room, as she pulled the zipper up, Zora looked into the mirror, not to check, to confirm. The woman in the reflection was no longer the one who had stood outside the halcyon house in the fog, no longer the one in the war room with the leather notebook, no longer the one watching the city choose sides. This woman, standing straight, gaze steady, was the result of all of it. The gala that night was one of the largest events of the year. Tech leaders, investors, global health organizations, international press, because Zora's regulatory approval had become world news. Her name was printed on the backdrop. Her face appeared across the massive screens. Dr. Zora Bennett, redefining ethical intelligence. Flash after flash as she entered. Congratulations, handshakes. We're so proud of you. The city that had once questioned her stability, now looked at her like an irreplaceable structure. Zora smiled. At the right level, at the right moments. Never rushing, never stopping. Ethan was there, across the room, no longer at the center, no longer surrounded by founders. He wore a dark suit, perfect as always. But for the first time, he was not the one creating gravity. He was standing inside her. Their eyes met. No drama, no anger, just the shared understanding that the story had reached a point of no return. Lila was there too, not beside him. Not near Zora, standing in a smaller circle, her voice still warm, her smile still flawless, but the orbit around her tighter than it used to be. In power systems, no one needs to be excluded. Distance is enough. When the host introduced Zora to the stage, the entire room stood. Applause that seemed to go on and on, not because they knew what was about to happen, because they believed she would speak about the future. She walked up. Each step measured in stillness, the microphone waiting, the lights directly in her eyes. She looked out at the room, once the battlefield of narrative, now the place where truth would stand. Zora did not open her speech, did not mention technology, did not speak about achievement. She turned slightly to her left. The process server was already there. Right position, right moment. The room did not understand yet. Only a few, the ones who lived in governance, recognized. Silence moved like a wave. Zora took the white envelope from her clutch, placed it in his hand. Please confirm receipt. Her voice was not loud, not cold, just a sentence placed exactly where it belonged. The pen touched paper, a small sound. But in that room, it landed like a period. Then she lifted her hand. The wedding ring, the diamond, catching the light in sharp, cold fragments. She removed it. No pause, no glance. Placed it on top of the envelope. One simple movement. A symbol ending. No accusation. No names. No drama. Just an image. Cameras exploded. No one spoke. No one breathed. In that moment, the entire city understood. Not through information, through the structure of the image. A black woman, standing alone on a stage, returning her marriage like an asset whose contract had expired. Not losing control, not collapsing, not crying, concluding. Ethan did not move. Lila did not move. Both stood in the same room, looking at an image of a story they no longer had the right to write. Zora did not look at them. She turned, walked down, the sound of her heels against the floor. Slow, steady, like a heartbeat. The video was online within 12 minutes. No long caption, just the image. The internet did the rest. This is not revenge. This is authorship. She didn't expose him. She concluded the contract. Power is quiet. The phrases spread like a network. No one asked what had happened. The image was enough. In media, words can be debated. Images cannot. When Zora stepped outside, the night wind from the bay moved around her. The glass doors closed behind. The noise of the room cut off. She stood on the steps and took a long breath. Not from relief, because for the first time in months, there was no story being written about her in a room she was not in. The ring was no longer on her hand. There was no emptiness, only alignment. Later, they would call it the image that ended a marriage. The image that redefined power. The image that taught Silicon Valley how a woman leaves. But for Zora, it was only a moment. The moment she returned, a symbol, and kept the entire story. Because disclosure is not about telling the truth. It is about placing the truth into an image no one can distort. And in that image, for the first time since everything began, Zora was no longer part of the system. She was the one defining it. The rooms where power once lived always carry a distinct scent. Polished wood, leather, black coffee, and something unnamed. The feeling that decisions made here can alter the trajectory of many lives. The room today was no different. The long oak table, the dark leather chairs, the glass wall overlooking the bay, the water flat like a sheet of metal. But the power had left before they entered. Zora arrived early, not to prepare. She always arrived early. The habit of someone who believes time is the only structure that cannot be negotiated. She took the seat marked by a small card with her name. Beside her sat Marianne, opening her laptop, aligning her pen with the edge of the table, as she always did. No one spoke about emotions. No one asked if she was okay. This was not a room for comfort. This was where chapters were closed in legal language. Ethan entered after. For the first time since she had known him, he did not control the rhythm of his steps. Not because he was weak, because he was walking into a room where every familiar rule had been rewritten. His suit was still perfect. Tie straight, shoes polished. But his eyes, the eyes of a man who had once been the center of every negotiation, were searching for an anchor that wasn't there. He looked at Zora, not angry, not accusing, just one question he had never had to ask in his life. How did this happen? Lila came in last, still elegant, still upright, still carrying the leather bag Zora had given her the day she signed her first major contract. But today it looked like an object from another story. She did not look at Zora. She sat down, the distance between the three of them large enough that nothing needed to be said. The firm's attorney began in a neutral voice. Language without emotion. Settlement framework. Reputational containment. Financial separation. Non-interference clause. Phrases like blocks of concrete, heavy, immovable, unbendable. Zora listened, Not like a wife signing divorce papers. Like a founder closing a deal. Terms were read. Ownership, equity, non-disclosure, governance protection. Each sentence, a boundary drawn. Not between her and Ethan, between past and future. There was a moment when the attorney stopped and asked, "Do both parties agree?" Ethan spoke for the first time, his voice low. "Zora." He did not continue. Not because there was nothing to say, because every story he had ever used, logic, emotion, reason, did not exist in this room. This was not a conversation. This was confirmation. He looked at her. "Did you plan all of this?" Not an accusation, just the astonishment of a man realizing he had never fully understood the woman in front of him. Zora met his gaze, her eyes not cold, not soft, aligned. "No," she said, "I plan to remain. Not to win, not to destroy, to exist without being rewritten." Lila looked up. For the first time since the gala, their eyes met. So many things could have been said in that moment. Years, vows, the nights they sat on an office floor eating cold pizza, dreaming of a future where women like them would not have to ask permission to exist. But no one spoke. Because friendship, when it breaks at its deepest level, does not need an ending. It simply stops existing. The documents were passed forward, white pages with black text. Marianne pointed to the signature lines. Zora picked up the pen Ethan had given her. She signed. Her signature did not shake, did not rush. It was not the signature of someone losing something. It was the signature of someone confirming ownership of her own life. Ethan signed next. Slower, he set the pen down like a man who had just finished a negotiation he didn't know he had already lost. Lila signed last. A small signature, precise, like everything she had ever done. But this time, there was no narrative to contain it. When it was over, the attorney closed the folder. Execution complete. No applause, no conclusion, just a sentence. And in that sentence, the entire old structure disappeared. Ethan stood. He looked at Zora one more time. "Was there ever a moment," he asked, "you thought we could fix this?" Zora considered. "Not long. Fixing is for systems that are broken," she said. This one was rewritten. Not by him, not by Lila. By truth, she stood, collected her documents, thanked Marianne. Ordinary gestures, like any other meeting. At the door, she looked back at the room. The long table, the leather chairs, the glass wall facing the bay. Everything exactly the same. Only one thing had changed. There was no power left in it. Because power does not live in a place. It lives in a person, and the person had taken it with her. Outside, the wind was stronger. The city continued. Other meetings, other deals, other stories. Zora stood on the steps and took a deep breath. Not from relief, from a simple truth. She had just walked out of the room where her marriage ended and had not left a single part of herself behind. Behind her was a closed structure. Ahead, not a new life. Her life, for the first time, with no one else holding access. 1 year after the gala night, San Francisco still woke beneath its familiar veil of fog. But for Zora, the city was no longer something to conquer. It had become a horizon. No longer a battlefield. No longer a mirror reflecting the stories other people tried to write about her. Just a place she moved through each morning with the steady rhythm of someone who had stopped seeking permission to exist. Her new office sat closer to the water. Not the tallest, not the largest, but its glass walls opened directly to the bay, where the afternoon light touched the wooden floor like a quiet promise. The walls no longer held media portraits, no magazine covers, only one framed image. A small lab, 3 young women standing in front of a whiteboard, laughing. The Bennett Fellowship for Ethical Founders, the program Zora created 6 months after the settlement. Not to prove anything, but to build a system where women like her would not have to learn how to survive alone before they were recognized. Her life had not slowed down. It had become clearer. In the morning, she ran along the shoreline. No phone, no timelines, only the sound of waves breaking. In the evening, she read research drafts from the young founders the fellowship supported. Emails that began with, "I didn't think someone like you would ever read my work." Zora always replied, "Someone like you is exactly why I built this." She no longer saw Ethan, not in power rooms, not at events, not in any narrative, only once in an airport corridor. They passed each other, did not stop, did not turn. Not because there was nothing to say, but because their story had already been closed in the right place and did not need to be reopened in a nameless hallway. As for Lila, Zora heard fragments, a small agency in New York, projects that no longer defined an industry, a Medium essay about reinventing after public misalignment. Zora read it, felt no victory, no regret, only the understanding that everyone lives inside the story they choose to write. What the city remembered about Zora was no longer the image of the ring on the envelope. It was the rooms she created, the mentorship programs, the governance policies major funds quietly adopted after her case, never naming her, yet unmistakably shaped by it. She had not destroyed the system. She had forced it to evolve. One afternoon, at a conference on the future of ethical technology, a young founder asked, "If you could go back, would you do anything differently?" The room fell silent. The question everyone always wanted, the question about revenge, about pain, about loss. Zora smiled. The light from the glass wall caught her eyes, the same way it had the first time she stepped onto that stage. "I didn't build any of this to respond to what happened," she said. "I built it so nothing like that would ever define me again. Not to win, not to get even, to create a structure where her story did not depend on anyone else."